Hello, Janice.
Hello, Anthony.
Everything going well?
Oh, as well as it can be, making the most.
All right, today we're going to talk about court-appointed strangers. So most of us would sort of cringe at the idea of a random stranger or bureaucrat having power over us and our lives and our decisions. But that's exactly what happens with a court-appointed stranger. Specifically, today we're going to talk about guardians in the context of guardians being a court-appointed stranger with power over the financial and healthcare decisions of our senior citizens.
So today we will discuss how guardians get their power, some unnerving examples, how it's always about money, how to avoid this type of stranger, and other types of court-appointed strangers.
All right, very good. Let's jump right into it. So how do these guardians get into power? It always starts with a court or some other authority getting involved. It can be, for example, an accusation that a family member or a caretaker is taking advantage of one of our seniors. You know, that accusation could come from a doorman in Manhattan. That would be a good example, or a primary care physician, something like that. But it can also be something as random as a senior going to his bank and making, let's say, a large cash deposit, or some other transaction that seems unusual. I'm doing air quotes, unusual.
Yep, unusual. Yeah.
So that the bank teller thinks it's, something that would trigger a red flag and maybe call the courts or a social worker or something along those lines. Basically, anything that puts you in the system. Again, more air quotes.
The system. I like your red flag analogy. Yes, something that would throw off a red flag.
But once you're in the system, I mean, in the best case scenario, you'll come out unscathed in terms of your personal finances and healthcare decisions, but you'll still owe these court-appointed strangers just tons of fees for somebody you've never met or decided to hire that the court just chose for you. And in the very worst case, you not only will you owe those fees, but they will have complete control over your financial decisions and your healthcare decisions, which is just really, really, I mean, I'm getting an upset stomach just thinking about that. If that happened to me, Now, so bottom line, this really happens, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but this really only happens if you have signs of wealth, and that makes you kind of a target. And from what I gather, most of our senior citizens already know this. They know that if they have any money, people are trying to scam them every day. So most of our seniors are sharp. They have experience, they've lived long lives, and they can see a lot of this coming a mile away. But then, for various reasons, sometimes it still happens, which is not great.
No, some of these scammers are pretty tricky.
And sometimes it's not a scam. The scam involves the court system, which it's very difficult to fight, right? So,
yeah.
All right. So let's get into some unnerving examples. And I'm going to reference, I don't usually like doing this, but this is actually a pretty good example. I don't like referencing TV shows. I've actually read somewhere that that's kind of one of the worst conversational errors you can make is trying to strike up a conversation with somebody about a TV show. It just tends to
Especially if they haven't seen it.
Exactly.
They just have that blank face, I have no idea what you're talking about.
So at the risk of making that faux pas, I'm going to talk about a Netflix show called Dirty Money. Okay. Now, in season 2, I believe episode 5 of Netflix Dirty Money, there's an episode called The Guardians. Now, I'm going to warn you that this episode is obviously very sort of dramatized and sensationalized. So it's not, don't take it too seriously, but it is accurate for the most part. And some examples they give. So basically this episode is about court-appointed guardians being put in place for senior citizens, and basically just taking over their financial decisions, selling their homes, and so forth. I'll give you a couple examples. So I guess this is spoiler alert if you want to watch it.
I was going to say spoiler alert.
So yeah, Netflix Dirty Money episode 5. Spoiler alert if you don't want to hear this. Fast forward about a minute or two. Yeah. So in one example, there was an older gentleman from Boston. And he lived by himself in his family home, the home he grew up in, and he actually owned 2 of the neighboring properties, or a few of the neighboring properties. And because, he had these houses, he was a ripe financial target. An attorney was able to get into his life, get him committed to a healthcare facility, right, against his will, and, was able to get power of attorney to sell this man's family home out from under him, as well as the neighboring properties. Very, very sad story.
Yeah, that's pretty awful.
Yeah. There's another example of a businessman in Texas. He's small business owner, very successful. He met a girlfriend who was younger than him, not ridiculously younger than him, I think like 10 years younger than him. They were together for 14 years. This is not a fly-by-night gold digging situation. Yeah. So they got married and he wanted to buy a home, right, for his new family. And he went to his bank with a bunch of cash, which I kind of alluded to earlier. And that triggered the red flags, exactly. The courts got involved. He didn't ask for any help. The courts got involved, decided that he was not competent to manage his own money. I think they actually separated him from his wife. And instead they appointed, I think, some very, very distant relative who he had never met before to be in charge of all his financial affairs. And they proceeded to drain his estate, which is, again, very, very sad. I don't like talking about this negative stuff, but I just got to point it out so you're aware.
It's interesting to point out, though, because it happens. Even though it's a TV show, I mean, this does happen in real life.
So one more negative story, just to drive home that this stuff does exist. And this is from one of my cases, or one case that I was peripherally involved with. We're going to call this lady Elena. And she was a very kind lady in her, I think, late 80s. And she had 4 adult daughters who seemed to have a reasonably good relationship with her. Nothing that I noticed. But one day, somebody accused the daughters of something. I don't really even remember what. And so a random attorney was appointed as Elena's guardian. Right? When I say random, I mean that these are attorneys who are on the Rolodex of some sort for the courts, but they generally have no connection to the person, in this case, Elena, whatsoever. They've never met before, right? So first, the guardian got a restraining order against the 4 daughters. So he separated and isolated Elena from her children, which is wow. Oh man, I hate telling these stories.
No.
Then the guardian, the court-appointed stranger, made a new will for Elena on her behalf, donating all of her wealth to a Catholic charity. And guess what? Elena was not Catholic, but the guardian was.
Interesting.
I think that's more of a red flag than going to the bank. But anyway.
Way bigger red flag, yes.
So then he even went so far as to create burial and funeral instructions for Elena that were consistent with, I guess, Catholic rituals or customs. Again, she is not Catholic.
Wow.
It's very odd stuff. I think sort of kind of justifying his other odd behaviors. And, I'm actually not sure. I didn't follow this case all the way to the bitter end. I'm not sure if the daughters were able to undo everything. But even if they were, even if justice was served, in a sense, and they were able to get rid of this guy, he probably, quote unquote, earned tens of thousands in fees from Elena that he would get paid and then just walk away. So there's basically no downside for bad behavior by these guardians, these court-appointed strangers. At worst case scenario, they wring a bunch of fees out of these kind of vulnerable senior citizens. And in best case scenario, they just take over their entire checkbook, right? Essentially.
Wow.
Yeah. And I met this guardian, and sometimes this job shows me a lot about human beings. Let's put it that way.
That is a very politically correct way of stating something.
So anyway, on the brighter, no, this is not brighter yet. Anyway, point 3.
We're not there yet. We're getting there.
Point 3 is that these court-appointed guardians, these situations are always about the money. So you may be thinking, oh, well, I know it's not a perfect system, but we do need the courts and we do need guardians for checks and balances. And I agree that's theoretically true. Now, the challenge I give to you is show me a case where the senior citizen has no money or no wealth to be drained, and I'll show you a much faster outcome and a guardian or court-appointed stranger who's much more reluctant to get involved. I have never seen a guardian or court-appointed stranger sink their teeth into a senior citizen who has no money, because there's no incentive. It's all about human incentives, yeah?
Yeah.
Very sad stuff. All right, so here's the good news. Pretty easy, not easy, but it is very possible to avoid these situations. So how do you avoid coming under the power of a court-appointed stranger? And it boils down to 2 things. You got to have an estate plan, and you must have a team in place, okay? Which should I do first, Janice, the team or the plan?
That's a good question. I think that the plan.
Okay, cool.
I'd want to know, how do they plan?
So having a plan in place means that even if somebody's able to successfully get you, to get the court to think that you're incompetent and can't make your own decisions, if you have a plan in place, at least it's your trusted trustee or guardian who takes over, not some court-appointed stranger. At least it's somebody who you have a relationship with, somebody who you presumably trust or at least have confidence in, who will be in charge of your financial affairs. So, in the example of that gentleman from Boston, whose house was sold out from under him, that attorney was able to get a court to deem him incompetent. But if he had an existing plan with somebody he trusted, then even when the court deemed him incompetent, then his plan would just kick in. And his trusted guardian would come into place, not some random person.
That knew his wishes, his wills, his wants.
And just was generally a human being who was sympathetic and, knew him. Exactly, yeah. So that's how a plan is important to avoiding this outcome. Yeah, it's not great if somebody's able to get you a court to say that you're incompetent. Nobody wants that, especially if you're not, not really. But at least you have this backup plan to make sure that doesn't result in bigger bad outcomes. Another point about the plan is you want it to be in place for as long as possible. So if you want to do it as soon as possible, because if you start a plan now and then 10 years from now somebody makes the accusation or a red flag makes people think that you might not have capacity to make your own decisions, then you can point to this plan that you made decades ago.
Yep.
As a proof.
Long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. And the court will have a hard time saying, well, no, this plan is just part of his incompetence, and this is, I got to throw this out. Unless they're willing to say that you've been, mentally unfit for 10 years.
Right.
They have to respect the plan.
Right.
So get that plan done now. Now, what I mean by team is you want to have professionals around you who you trust, who can be there for you. An attorney is a good example, and who might be able to help you with your plan and perhaps even be your trustee. But also let's talk about a primary care physician, right? Who can testify on your behalf about your capacity. So you're not relying on some random doctor who doesn't know you, who doesn't know your quirks or how you joke around, who doesn't know how you like to talk. A random doctor might be more quick to deem you incompetent, right? You want your guy in there, somebody who knows you. Does that make sense?
Maybe your guy that knew you 10 years ago when you wrote your plan and said, oh, nope, he was great.
Yeah, exactly. And who knows your history and knows that, he's always spoken slowly. That's just how he talks, whatever, as opposed to somebody who just met you. I mean, that's a weird example. I just made that one up, but something along those lines.
No, but it's a good, if they know you over time and they know you're different, like you said, your quirks or can say, no, he's had all his wits about him for 20 years, fit as a fiddle.
So having that team in place to, I guess, vouch for you both financially and medically is another line of defense. Let's call it that. All right. So lastly, let's talk about some other types of court-appointed strangers. The guardians that we just talked about are one of the scariest types because they do come into your life while you're living. But there are a couple of other examples, sort of after death, that can basically ruin your estate planning. So anytime you have your estate has to go through probate court, there is a chance that you will need a temporary guardian, sometimes called a GAL, to represent the interests of anyone involved in your case who's either under 18, maybe has any sort of mental impairment, or who themselves are older. Janice, you've worked with me on several cases with temporary guardians. Yes. How has that worked out for us?
Oh, it's super. It's like sometimes, what is it, trying to go straight, but you're really going backwards, pulling teeth. I can make of lots of analogies here, but it's definitely challenging and adds on, what do you say, a good year to your probate process trying to deal with them?
I mean, it is a coin toss or a roll of the dice. Sometimes you get somebody we got one who was really good once, and it was just like working with another professional. I
wasn't on that case.
By contrast, you get the temporary guardians who give you a lot of the dog ate my homework type excuses.
Yes. Those are the ones I know.
Yeah.
Those are the cases that I work with you. Yes, the dog ate my homework 15 times 6 months later.
So, right. So probating the will, which under normal circumstances could hopefully be as quick as 2 to 3 months. I think in this case has been over 18 months, maybe closing in on 2 years.
Yep.
And we're just sitting around waiting for this guardian to do her job, essentially.
Waiting for how many times it's in the mail.
Yep.
It's in the mail.
Yep.
I'll get it to you tomorrow. I'll get it to you next week.
Yeah. Anyway.
Sorry.
So another example of a court-appointed stranger who can really wreak havoc on your estate is the public administrator. The public administrator is like in criminal cases, Janice, when you get arrested and maybe you can't afford your own criminal defense attorney, you get a public defender.
Yes.
I think the stereotype, not always, but the stereotype is you're not getting Johnny Cochran. You're just getting like this fresh off the boat. Is that the right word? No, fresh out of law school attorney.
Fresh out of law school, yeah.
Yeah, who probably doesn't know that much, right? So that's what you're getting with the public administrator. You're getting the state's version of the free executor. And I would use that. That's like using the post office when you probably want FedEx. Does that make sense?
It does, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it might get the job done, but if it's important to you, you usually want to do FedEx.
Yes.
So one example of how that sort of manifests itself in a worse outcome for your estate. We were involved peripherally on a public administrator estate, and we went to the apartment of the person who passed away. And at first we thought it had been robbed, and we were going to call the police. It was literally drawers thrown, the mattress overturned, knife slashes through the sofa. And
jeez.
Yeah. Just drawers upturned and emptied and thrown on the floor. So we thought it looked like a robbery, and we were going to call the police until we realized, oh no, the public administrators came through.
Wow.
So I do sympathize in that you are supposed to do a thorough search for any, cash withdrawals or things like that.
Sure.
But the way they left the place, let's just say it felt less than professional. Yeah.
Yeah. No tact, no couth. Yeah. Like they were serving a warrant for a felony or something.
Oh, yeah, it did look like they were, looking for going through a drug lord's house or something like that.
Wow.
So that was just one example that I saw with my own eyes. So anyway, the solution to all of these issues, the solution to avoiding a court-appointed stranger entering your life or your estate is to avoid the probate courts. The bottom line is make sure you're not in the system. And you should be okay. And I've given you some tips on how to do that. And I think that covers our talk on these court-appointed strangers.
Wow. It's all interesting stuff. If you want to dig into this further, I definitely suggest Anthony's book, How to Hire an Executor, available on Amazon. That'll tell you some of the things and go into it a little bit deeper. Definitely check it out. And I think that's all. Hopefully everybody learned something from this and can prepare.
Yeah, I try not to do these episodes too often because it's kind of a downer, but sometimes I do need to point out the downside so folks know why it's important to do certain planning.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Thanks, Janice, for jumping on, and we'll talk next time.
Talk soon.
Bye now.